For all of the military advancements that China has made in recent years, it still can't compete with the US in one area: the skies. The US Air Force is a terrifying prospect for China for many reasons, not least because it knows that America leads the charge when it comes to the quality of its equipment and its pilots. And if war were to ever break out between the countries, China would find itself cowering before the might of America's craft. But why? China has a very strong military. It's the second largest military spender in the world, just behind the US, and it's ramping up its nuclear capabilities with every passing year. But when it comes to the skies, China pales in comparison, and Beijing knows it. The reason for China's fear starts with one of the most crucial aspects of warfare: sheer numbers. The simple fact is that the US's airborne capabilities stretch far beyond anything that China can handle. According to Global Firepower, America has a little over 660,000 Air Force personnel. Of course, not all of these are pilots. The US doesn't have the ability to send a 500,000-strong death fleet of planes in China's direction, but what it does have is an extensive infrastructure of pilots and support crews that can coordinate massive offensives that would cause major problems for Beijing. That's not to say that China doesn't have an impressive number of personnel itself. The People's Liberation Army Air Force, PLAAF, has about 400,000 members. Impressive numbers, though over 260,000 fewer than the US Air Force. Of course, it's not just people who make up an Air Force. Equipment is a vital component. That's where the US really comes out on top. It has a total stock of 13,300 aircraft, 9,975 of which are combat-ready, compared to China's fleet of 3,166. In other words, the United States has about 4 times the number of aircraft that China has, meaning it would easily overwhelm the PLAAF in terms of sheer numbers. Digging deeper, it's clear that China has focused most of its Air Force spending on fighter jets, with the country having 1,199 of these types of planes available. But even that impressive number pales in comparison to the United States, which has 1,914 fighters, along with a far more versatile fleet of planes that go beyond dogfighting capabilities. For instance, the US has 962 fixed-wing transports compared to China's 288. It also has far more planes available for training, with China having less than a sixth of the 2,634 craft that the US can use to give its next generations of pilots some much-needed flight experience. No matter where you look, be it attack planes, tankers, helicopters, or special mission planes, America comes out on top every single time. Its air-based firepower is on a level that no other military can match. The US simply has more options when it comes to moving its troops around and conducting air missions against China or its territorial partners. That's not to say that the PLAAF is useless. It would be able to cause some damage to America's forces, but for every plane that Beijing could down, the US would have plenty in reserve, ready to replace it. In a war of attrition, China's stock would run low far sooner, giving the US complete dominance of the skies. Still, sheer numbers aren't the only way that a battle is won. Quality of equipment is just as important, and what better place to look than the crown jewels of each country's fighters? For China, that crown jewel, at least right now, is the Chengdu J-20 Mighty Dragon, a stealth fighter that entered into service in 2018, following its maiden flight in 2011. It's a fifth-generation plane that was designed specifically to compete with America's F-22 Raptor. The plane is capable of a top speed of about 1,670 miles per hour and can fly for almost 2,800 miles before it needs to refuel. It has low jet engine intakes and is barely visible on a radar cross-section, making it ideal for sneak attacks, and it comes equipped with an active electronically scanned array (AESA) that transmits targeting data directly to its firing systems. Speaking of those firing systems, the craft comes equipped with an internal cannon that can be deployed during close-quarters combat. A pair of bays underneath the craft can hold several PL-10 air-to-air missiles, with another bay in its belly carrying larger PL-21 and PL-12CD missiles. In all, it's a flying death machine that can rain fire on an opponent through a combination of built-in guns and missile strikes. So it's no surprise that China is building as many as possible. Nikkei Asia even suggested that it built more J-20s in 2022 than the 187 F-22s that America manufactured. with plans in place to produce another 40 to 50 per year for the foreseeable future. Of course, not all of those craft will go straight into the PLAAF, with China having the opportunity to sell some. Still, it's an impressive fighter. And if its sole opponent in the US Air Force was the F-22 that it seems to have been built as a counterpart to, China would at least be able to claim parity with the United States. But it's not just the F-22 that China has to worry about. The F-35 is another of the US's best fighters, and the combined force of both would overwhelm the J-20. Where China is focusing most of its efforts on a single fighter, the US has two extremely advanced aircraft that give it more versatility. The F-22 is the closest to the J-20, with its top speed of about 1,500 miles per hour being just a smidge below the J-20's. It has an external radar cross-section, which makes it remarkably difficult to detect, and is able to supercruise. That means it's able to maintain supersonic speeds without the need for afterburners, making it even harder to detect. The thrust vectoring system built into the aircraft also makes it one of the most agile ever made. So even if the J-20 is faster than the F-22, it may not be able to hit it. It's worth focusing on the ability to supercruise a little more for a simple reason. The J-20 can't do it. In fact, none of the fighters in China's stock can, because they're all equipped with the WS-10 Taihang, a turbofan engine that delivers high thrust but can't maintain supersonic speeds without engaging afterburners. That's a problem for stealth operations. Whenever a craft engages its afterburners, it essentially gives the game away when it comes to its location. So for a J-20 to maintain supersonic speeds, it has to let the US know where it is. But for the F-22 and F-35, supercruising can be used to maintain high speeds, with a large weapons load, while the craft itself essentially appears as barely visible on most radar systems. As for the F-35, it's actually a touch slower than both the J-20 and F-22, being capable of hitting a top speed of 1,200 miles per hour. However, it has slightly more advanced avionics, the tech inside the craft, than the F-22. Both have advanced systems that include radar, sensors, and communication systems. However, the F-35 adds to that with a helmet-mounted display, which can show the pilot real-time information about both their plane and the surrounding environment. But the standout feature of this plane is its ability to take off from a very short runway before landing vertically. In other words, it's able to operate from bases that don't have large runways, such as assault ships and smaller airfields. That's a capability that neither the F-22 nor the J-20 can match. And of course, both the F-22 and F-35 have similar weapon systems, with cannons and air-to-air missiles to match the J-20. In a straight comparison, the J-20 seems to come out just about on top, but the F-22 is very close. And when combined with the more versatile F-35, America would definitely have the advantage in pure dogfighting capabilities. And when you add the ability to supercruise into the mix, America's top fighters have a clear advantage over China's in the stealth game. In short, China knows that it's chasing the US when it comes to its fighters. The J-20 is a direct response to the F-22, and even China's experiments with unmanned flights ape those already conducted by the US. Beijing is playing catch-up. And while it's closing the distance, it's far from achieving air superiority based on numbers or equipment. Speaking of air superiority, China is also terrified of America's Air Force because it takes a very different approach to the PLAAF. China tends to focus on using its planes to support its ground troops, rather than to establish a superior presence in the skies. It's a similar approach to the one that Russia has tried to use in Ukraine, with planes flying low to take out ground-based targets. But this approach has two problems. First, it makes planes vulnerable. Providing support to ground-based troops means flying low, and the lower you go, the closer you get to anti-air defense. This is a lesson that Russia has learned quickly during its invasion of Ukraine, with Ukraine's anti-air defenses already being responsible for shooting down at least 130 craft by August 2023, according to RAND. The fact that China takes a similar approach will be terrifying to Beijing, because it means that it's tactically outmatched by the US. And when you consider the fact that the US has far superior anti-air equipment to Ukraine, the situation would only become more dire for China's pilots. Second, China's ground-focused approach naturally takes its focus away from the skies. That's where America could come swooping in to dominate China's airspace thanks to 5 letters, COMAO. COMAO stands for Composite Air Operations, and the idea behind this tactic is to bring a versatile range of capabilities into a single airborne attack. Typically, that means several countries combining their forces and their craft in joint operations, where one set of planes may provide ground support, for instance, another set may circle the skies, defending against any fighters that would draw near. The ultimate goal is to create one large package of aircraft that combines their forces to essentially take over several hundred square miles of airspace. A Komeo usually has a package commander who coordinates the routes, timings, and targets for the aircraft, and because the package is so large, some Komeos incorporate up to 100 planes and helicopters. There is built-in redundancy. If a craft or a mission fails, there are others on hand to replace it and launch a secondary assault. This is a problem for China. With its planes generally focused on the ground, the US could use Komeo tactics to dominate the skies above. Its fighters will be able to launch aerial assaults, both on China's planes and targets on the ground, while the PLAAF would lose the ability to escape danger by gaining altitude, because more American flyers would be stationed higher up to greet them. Combine all of this with the fact that Komeos usually bring together multiple countries, the US would likely involve NATO in its operations, and you get exceptionally coordinated attacks that far outstrip anything that the PLAAF can do. In short, the US would have complete air superiority. And even without support from other countries or NATO, America has such a versatile stock of aircraft that it could essentially launch Komeos on its own, with China having little recourse due to only coming close to matching the states in fighter plane numbers, with everything else falling behind. Versatility is clearly the key, and it's the lack of it that would have Beijing running scared if the US started launching complex aerial attacks combined with anti-air defenses. Still, China is at least trying to make up for its lack of aerial tactical nous with new anti-air defenses. In November 2022, the People's Liberation Army (PLA) unveiled the FK-3000 air defense missile system, along with two others, the HQ-16FE and the Red 11 systems, at Airshow China 2022. It was the FK-3000 that stole the show, as it comes equipped with a powerful air defense missile that can deflect most standard ammunition used by fighter planes. Add to that a mini-missile designed to resist cluster bombs and a special transmitter to jam radio signals, and it's a powerful anti-air force. Even better for China, much of the vehicle that holds this weaponry is remote-controlled. That includes its transporter, erector, launcher, and radar (TELAR) platform, which holds a turret that can be fired remotely to fend off attacks. More support comes from a pair of auxiliary vehicles, again unmanned, that can handle ground combat to defend the main vehicle. The FK-3000 is impressive, but it can't do anything against America's fighters. Instead, it's designed to ward off attack helicopters, cruise missiles, and similar large targets. No stealth detection capabilities means it has its limitations. All of those munitions and equipment could, and likely would, be deployed by the US in a Komeo attack, but the very nature of Komeos means that China's anti-air defenses would be able to do little against anything other than large targets that are somewhat close to the ground. For the many craft that are either out of range or equipped with stealth technology, the FK-3000 would essentially be useless. Again, we see Beijing doing what it's doing with fighters, playing catch-up. Of course, you could argue that the US couldn't launch an aerial attack from home soil to China. The distance is too great to fly from one country to the other, essentially protecting each one against the other's aerial forces, right? That's not the case. According to Al Jazeera, the United States maintains 750 bases around the world, with at least 220 of those bases being in Asian countries that could easily put the US into range. Japan is the frontrunner and a vital military partner to the US with 120 bases. South Korea coming in close behind with 73. Australia hosts 7 and will likely build more as its military ties to the US grow, with both Kuwait and Saudi Arabia having 10 US bases. Looking at a map of the world, you'll see why this is such a problem for China. Combined, those bases offer coverage from the east, west, and south. China is essentially surrounded by major countries that hosts US troops and could, in the event of war, become launching points for Komeos and other American aerial operations. In contrast, China only has one official remote military base located in Djibouti, meaning it's still not within range, and certainly not to the extent that America is to Beijing. Granted, China is looking to expand its overseas presence. Stars and Stripes reports that Beijing may look to build new bases in Myanmar, Bangladesh, and Cambodia in the coming years. Plus, its investments in infrastructure projects in many Asian and African countries provide it with some leverage to establish more bases in the future. But to achieve the type of coverage that the US has, China would need to establish a presence in South America and Canada, neither really being options for Beijing. China is trying to catch up once again. It's doing so covertly, especially with its loans for infrastructure projects that could place many smaller countries in its back pocket. But the US is far ahead in that game because it's established itself in several Asian countries that put it within striking distance of China. Simply put, America can launch attacks on China without Beijing being able to reciprocate, at least without a lot of effort and aircraft carriers, putting China at yet another aerial disadvantage. Still, if China had better pilot training, that would at least be something it could hold against the States. Unfortunately for Beijing, it doesn't. According to Air Education and Training Command, AETC, the US Air Force Academy pumps out over 3,400 cadets every year. Those cadets are training in the principles and techniques used to fly advanced planes and helicopters, in addition to receiving ground training, so they're at least somewhat effective if they're grounded. Some cadets also undergo officer development training, which improves their leadership and coordination skills. After completing this primary phase, the cadets are split into 3 groups, with each being an advanced training course focused on a specific type of craft. These groups include one for bombers and fighters, another for helicopter training, and yet another that teaches advanced operation of tankers and airlift planes. A 4th, and constantly growing, group is also selected to learn how to remotely fly unmanned craft. All told, a pilot cadet will get between 180 and 240 hours of flight training before they're deployed in the field, leaving them well equipped to handle almost anything thrown at them. As with everything else, the PLAAF lags behind in the training department. Beijing is aware of this too, which is why it's engaging in a concerted campaign to bring more Western influence into its training program. According to Sky News, the PLA started a recruitment drive in late 2022 aimed at attracting British military personnel to help train its pilots. The outlet says that around 30 former British pilots took the payday, with salaries reputed to be around £240,000, or approximately $300,000 per year. However, some are calling the move a breach of security. That makes sense. Not only do these British pilots have more experience than many of China's flyers, but they also understand Western aircraft. Who's to say they won't divulge secrets? This is obviously distressing news for all Western countries, including the US, but it's also an indicator that China is playing catch-up in training just as much as everywhere else. It wants to know how Western powers operate. It needs to find and benefit from experience that its own trainers simply don't have. And as long as it's offering so much money in exchange for that knowledge, it will be able to attract people who can improve its training outcomes. This could be a sign that China is getting desperate. And beyond splashing the cash to attract better trainers, it's also trying to force pilots through their training faster than ever before. In a July 2022 article, Le Monde reported that China had proudly proclaimed that cadets trained in the J-10, one of its multi-role fighters, had completed their training in 3 years rather than the standard 6. That was big news for Beijing. It had only started training pilots using the J-10s in 2010, with such a fast pilot turnaround being put down to an increased ability to conduct tactical training and live for operations. But is that really the case? Or is Beijing making the same mistake that Moscow makes by failing to ensure that its cadets have enough flight hours to be effective once they're engaged in active warfare? What China claims as a victory in training efficiency could simply be a rush job that says something very different. We're scared of the US, and we need more pilots now. Beyond that, secrecy surrounds China's Air Force training, as it does with so much of the PLA's operations, with propaganda and the occasional news report being the main sources of what they actually do. Regardless, Beijing recognizes the superiority of Western training. If it didn't, it wouldn't be spending around $9 million per year on former British pilots. But even if the Brits can teach China a thing or two, there's one more reason for Beijing to cower in the face of America's aerial might: nuclear weapons. The US and China are both capable of launching nukes, with China's growing arsenal being an obvious cause for concern for all Western nations. However, the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation, CAC, points out that it has extremely limited options when it comes to dropping nukes from the air. At best, it may be able to equip a plane with a nuke and hope to achieve a clean drop, but it's more likely that the plane will be shot out of the sky long before it delivered its payload. Beijing is trying to do something about this. The CAC reports that its development of the Zhan H-20 stealth bomber is likely to give it better nuclear capabilities from the skies, especially as its design is purposefully similar to the America's B-2 bomber. But that plane likely won't enter service until 2025 at the earliest, leaving China with no aerial nuclear threat until then. The US has that threat in abundance. Atomic Archive points out that the States has 2 bombers capable of launching nukes, the previously mentioned B-2A Spirit and the B-52H Stratofortress. What's more, it has 850 warheads, though not all being in commission, that it could launch from these planes. That stockpile is larger than the 350 total nukes that China is believed to have, which is already scary for Beijing. The fact that these bombs can be launched from the skies, likely out of the reach of any of China's anti-air defenses, is terrifying. Again, China is playing catch-up by trying to develop a bomber with similar capabilities. But until it has that and can manufacture at pace, the US will always hold the ultimate trump card if it somehow manages to lose in all other aspects on the aerial front. But based on what we've shared here, that isn't likely to happen. The US has more, better trained pilots and far more aircraft than the PLAAF. It has superior tactics because it knows how to use its versatile fleet to conduct coordinated attacks designed to achieve air supremacy rather than simply support ground troops. Plus, thanks to the US having bases established in so many countries that surround China, it's far more capable of launching attacks over Chinese airspace than Beijing is over America's territory. And even if all of that superiority fails to deliver an aerial victory for the US, it can always press the big red button and launch nukes from the sky to devastate China. It's no wonder that China is running scared. The only worry for the US Air Force is that China is trying to run toward it rather than away. With all of its investment into military modernization, coupled with Beijing's willingness to spend big to attract pilots, we may see China becoming a stronger aerial force in years to come. But what do you think? Is China right to be terrified of America's aerial capabilities? Or does it have some way to mitigate them that we haven't explored here? As always, tell us what you think in the comments section. Thank you for watching the video, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more military content from military experts.